Welcome to Break the Needle. I'm your host, Adam Zivo, and I'm here to tackle Canada's problems with drugs, addiction, and crime. Today, we're going to discuss the evolving media environment around Canada's national overdose crisis and addiction policies. What kind of biases are shaping news coverage here? What ideologies are playing out behind the scenes? Here to dive into this topic with us is Harrison Lowman, managing editor of The Hub. Welcome to the show, Harrison.
Adam, thanks so much for having me.
Now, Harrison, before you joined the Hub, you worked for TVO for many years as a producer of The Agenda. What was it like covering drug and addiction issues during that period?
Sure. So, as you know, TVO is the provincial public broadcaster, and we're often trying to put issues, often contentious issues, on the table to debate them on screen. They should basically mirror the debates that people are having at their kitchen table, one of these being around drug decriminalization. And I recall a specific debate in 2021, is it time to decriminalize all drugs, where it was cast as sort of there's growing support emerging for decriminalization. How should we sort of tell this story? We featured Kwame McKenzie, who is a psychiatrist and co-chaired at the time the Canada Expert Task Force on Substance Abuse. But Adam, we literally could not find a Canadian expert across the entire country who would come on television and push back against this, to the point where we literally had to go back to an advisor for the second Bush presidency, I believe, a man by the name of David Murray, former chief scientist in the U.S. federal government's Office of National Drug Control Policy, to be able to, have a counter narrative. To have
Now,
this debate, we literally had to find an American and go to another country.
quick point of clarification: you couldn't find any experts who were against decriminalization, or you couldn't find any experts who were against decriminalization and felt comfortable expressing these views on camera.
Well, listen, I didn't produce this show, but from what I found, we couldn't find anyone who had anything negative to say. And it just goes to show that, if you own the experts, you own the narrative, right? If
Mhm.
you are, if you dominate the pool of people that reporters, journalists, etc., like us are calling to get advice, and I don't know, how do you get the term expert?
Mhm.
We don't know how you gain that, but anyway, that's up for discussion. But if you want to basically control that, influence policy, if you occupy most of those faculty rooms, etc., you are going to own the messaging. The story being told to Canadians is this is not up for debate. This is decided, and this is how we're going, and this is how we will be implementing said policy.
So you can have groups of ideological experts who can hijack media discourse and push public policy into contentious and unpopular directions. Now, the counter argument to this might be that, well, if the experts all agree, maybe it is just uncontroversially a good idea, regardless of the fact that some people in the general population might disagree. But drug decriminalization is a great example where, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, all of these experts came together and said, well, this is going to be totally fine. It's going to save lives. It's going to be amazing. And that didn't turn out to be the case. And now most people would say that drug decriminalization in Canada has abjectly failed. Its staunchest supporters now disavow this policy.
Yeah, let's give room, at least, to be fair here, that we learn stuff along the way. Something on a textbook page is different than what's implemented in when it's actually on the street. So we'll give them that. We can get into why journalists are open to these sorts of ideas and are willing audiences for this sort of thinking. But yeah, let's just say we learned a lot along the way, and there's a lot of mistakes were made, and we're realizing this now. Some people are not, but some are.
Mhm. Well, what's interesting is that actually I remember I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Examiner back in early 2023 arguing that drug decriminalization, as it was designed in British Columbia, was doomed to fail. And it was strange because you had all of these experts who were in other media outlets saying it was going to be great, but it was fairly predictable from the outset that this wasn't going to work. And eventually, these experts relented and said, actually, this was poorly designed. And they cited the very reasons I raised concerns about. But for that period of time, it seemed like, this very obvious problem was not so obvious. Anyways, When we get back from our commercial break, we're going to talk about the evolving media landscape and how that is shaping media coverage of the addiction crisis today. So, see you guys in just a few minutes. And we're back with Harrison Lowman, the managing editor of The Hub. We're discussing how media bias and ideology influences reporting around the national addiction crisis. Now, Harrison, how did the media landscape around addiction change over the past few years? Obviously, what we can talk about today and what kind of perspectives are acceptable today are very different from what was the norm, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago.
So let's talk about the norm 4 or 5 years ago. Journalists are very empathetic. They want like human interest stories. So they're primed to like feel. And again, the left does not own empathy, but to feel for people who are struggling from addiction. Um, and stories were, very victim focused and about accommodating their needs, focus on them, and then society should sort of shift around them to accommodate XYZ. Approval of lifestyle choices, growing definitions of human rights in terms of you should be allowed to have access to illicit drugs, that should be, at, next to being able to have water, shelter, etc. And that if you push back against this, you hear from critics and often in journalism that the stakes are life and death. So
Mhm.
like to push back against this is to, promote the forthcoming deaths of the people who are addicts. I'll just add, so more recently, I think what broke the straw that broke the camel's back was a lot of stuff on YouTube, right? Like man on the street, viewing the streetscape. This is how this stuff is unfolded. These are sort of the consequences for everyday folks. And stuff around kids, like people saying, oh, this is going to impact my kid's school in this way. This is what the playground now looks like. Like you're starting to enter the average person's life and they're saying, what the heck happened? Like what allowed for this?
Mhm. It feels as if there were these journalists who were very focused on lived experience, right? And so they primarily cared about the experiences of drug users, and everything else was put to the wayside. And then over time, as the harmful consequences of these policies became increasingly apparent and well documented on YouTube, it became impossible for these journalists to ignore it and to maintain their ideological bubble. And so that slowly shifted media coverage of the addiction policy world to one that is a bit more normal and aligned with the beliefs of everyday Canadians.
Can I just say, Adam, it went from being like a public health issue to being like a safety issue in many ways. And like you were helped by NIMBYs. Like there were a lot of NIMBYs that are not okay with the decriminalization. Again, this is not just like, who are we trying to help here? If you take, the victim focused mentality to the nth degree, like you're doing whatever you can to facilitate this person's addiction and keep them alive. If you're pulling your lens back further, you're looking at the consequences for society. You're looking at like what types of lifestyles should we be approving of as a country and not being approving of. You're looking at the impact on public transit, et cetera. So it's all about perspectives.
Well, it's interesting that you use the term NIMBY. So I remember when I started writing for the National Post back in 2021, uh, oftentimes people who oppose these, uh, like for example, homeless encampments or addiction interventions, they were framed as being just heartless NIMBYs who wanted to maintain an idealized neighborhood without dealing with the realities of messy urbanism. But then over time, we saw, based on a lot of these YouTube clips and some of the more conservative reporting that was produced in this country, that they weren't just heartless NIMBYs and that many of their concerns were quite valid, and that you shouldn't disparage someone just because they don't want to be shouted at by angry drug addicts every single day.
I just want to reiterate again, like the left does not own empathy. Like you can be on the right, you can want rehabilitation to be at the center of recovery. I and you as well have people close to you that have suffered from addiction issues tremendously. And you can really care about them, and you can also not approve of drug decriminalization as the method to help them.
Mhm.
I just want like state that. Also conservatives get a bad rap for saying things like, we have finite resources, like we can't be paying for X, Y, Z. Like it's another thing that is a reality that we just have to face.
Mhm. And so there are also underlying structural issues within the world of journalism that has predisposed some reporting towards a more idealized view of drug addiction and crime. And so when we get back from this break, I want to talk more about that. And actually, as food for thought before we go to our commercial break, a lot of it comes back down to Vice News and its impact in the 2010s and how that shaped addiction reporting and how maybe hipsterism as a culture had reverberating repercussions on addiction reporting in the early 2020s. We'll see you in just a few minutes. And we're back. So before we went to break, I mentioned Vice News and its impact on drug reporting. Now, for those who don't know, Vice was a media empire that was ascendant in the 2010s. It was run by these, who would do crazy stories about visiting, let's say, gangs in Afghanistan or trying out different drugs in Colombia. And their stuff was very interesting and very, I don't know, fun. And they did a lot of reporting on harm reduction in the 2010s and were pioneering in that sense. But this was a space that was populated by journalists whose understanding of drug use was where to get the best ayahuasca in Mexico, right? Or where to find pure cocaine in South America. So maybe that shaped their perception of harm reduction because when your friends are mostly, let's say, struggling trust fund kids who are trying to become screenplay writers in New York City, and they're all looking for great cocaine, that might influence your writing on whether or not we should legalize drugs and provide a safe supply of drugs.
It's also Canadian outlet, Adam. Let's not forget that. It came from Montreal. I remember
Yeah.
during the Trudeau years, they did a whole blowout broadcast featuring Justin Trudeau when he legalized marijuana. One of the main reasons linked to him getting so much of the youth vote when he first came in with his majority was widely celebrated. I don't know. We can get into how marijuana, whether it is or isn't a gateway drug that then allows for,
Mhm.
people being more open about, more illicit drug use. But yeah, I think you could probably attribute some of that gonzo reporting to what we've seen unfold over the last few years.
Well, it's interesting. And so these Vice News reporters, they were pioneering in this space. And it took some time for other journalists to come into this space and realize, hey, wait a second, we can approach the issue of addiction and crime and harm reduction from a different lens. For example, I notice right now that there's a pretty healthy ecosystem of conservative minded journalists, whether at uh, they're part of this too, who have an understanding of harm reduction principles and write about it in a way that they didn't 5 years ago. And they can speak intelligently about it while at the same time criticizing it and providing an alternative narrative compared to, let's say, the Vice school of drug reporting.
There's a pushback on the left, Adam, against this stuff. It is, in my view, and many young people, as they look towards the right increasingly, that it's not cool to do this stuff. That to do the opposite and to find sort of a framework for your life and structure and being a contributing member of your society and community is actually, I sound like an old man here, but actually cool. Like, and
Mhm.
that this is certainly not how we want our cities to look, and not how we want to be helping our fellow citizens. Like, we don't want to. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, well, what I'm going to say first of all is like I know from following your social media that you just had your first kid, so you are an old man at this point, and you're allowed to complain about drugs because you have a child. Now,
Yeah.
I'm wondering to what extent.
I'm sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead. Go
No,
ahead.
no, well, okay, I'm gonna just go to the next question, which is, to what extent do you think that bad drug reporting is driven by a lack of scientific literacy? Because we know that not all journalists understand research very well. They don't understand quantitative research. They don't understand the importance of a sample size. And so they'll read some really bad studies and say, well, actually, this justifies some really radical policies when the science isn't actually there.
I suck at math and science. Most journalists do. They're you should always be hesitant in the first place when approaching science, right? Because it's incredibly complex. Um, but yeah, I think that as we've talked about, there was a clash between public health officials and additions experts, and journalists did not do a good job understanding the differences and like where those fractures were and what they were based upon. And instead, I don't know, we were less willing to rock the boat because it's easier to just kind of like keep the general narrative going. It's much more difficult to do. Again, kudos to you, what you've been doing, Adam, which is like, I don't know, trying to change the narrative. I remember being in public broadcasting and like you're on the ether, we were kind of starting to get to know each other. People were unfair to you. Like they thought they're like, this guy's crazy, whatever he's doing, like he's nefarious and all. But the names you've been called. But like it's much harder to be the outlier.
I mean,
It's
look at this
much
face.
more easier to do the
Do
the
I look
attack
so
journalist.
nefarious?
I don't know what's going on. I don't know your true intention.
Well, so my question here in the last 30 seconds, do you think that there is a need for greater scientific literacy amongst journalists, or can we find other workarounds?
Of course, and let's listen to all sides. Like let's, I don't know, have seminars and invite them in and have these folks explain to us why they think what they think. But again, at least you're hearing both sides, and we can get in this later. But there are still examples of documentaries and segments going out that
Mhm.
are not doing that.
Well, we'll be back after a few minutes following this commercial break. And we're back with managing editor of The Hub, Harrison Lowman, and we're discussing media bias and ideology with respect to drug and crime reporting. Now, I don't want to sound like that guy, but oftentimes there's criticism of how mainstream media covers the drug crisis, right? And there's a perceived ideological bias, and there's a distrust of traditional large publishers. So, Harrison, for someone like you help manage a smaller outlet that is disruptive and providing alternative perspectives while at the same time still being grounded in fact, because that's an important part too. Of course, there are lots of people who are disruptive, but maybe not as factually oriented. Where do you see the hub as fitting into this larger milieu within this ecosystem of competing media voices that are trying to guide the conversation on drug policy?
You know as well as anyone, Adam, given that I've edited you and your stuff, that like it's so important to be fact based. Like we're checking, like, I've relentlessly go through things. You show me a study, you quote this. I ask, where does that come from? What is it based on? What's the result? To make sure, because even with this too, and like we should go after certain people on the right too. Like they play fast and loose to get the result, the headline, the scene that they want. And hey, you want to convince people that there should be a policy correction? How about you approach people who are so primed now to be distrustful with facts and evidence and proof? Don't just serve them up what they want to hear. And I don't think we're going to get anywhere by yelling at each other on either side with like our own set of facts. We need to find some way in the middle. I know I sound like a
I
utopian
know, I know, I
optimist
know.
here,
But,
but
but here's the thing. So, what is factually true is not always easy to discern. You can point to a lake of water and say that's blue, and that's pretty uncontroversial. But if
yeah.
someone presents you with a complex study and they tell you that this proves X, and you're not entirely sure, then you have to actually fact check that study and the interpretation of that study, which goes back to my earlier question about scientific literacy. I asked whether journalists need greater scientific literacy, but is there a need for more training for news editors as well, and higher up. I mean, like Harrison, you know,
You're saying I
do,
need classes at it?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Do you need to go to a class to learn the basics of let's say quantitative analysis? Is there a need there for you and your colleagues?
Sure. I think even basic definitions, safe supply, safer supply. I had to ask you, I'm like, what? So now it's safer? What the heck does that mean? The terms are changing so much. Journalists are trying to use definitions that play it down the middle, but they're failing. I looked at you report the other day, unregulated drug supply, rather than just saying street drugs. Like the implication being through that term, and words are very important, that all drugs should be like regulated or overseen by some sort of supervisory body and entity. Like, I think it's important that we have some sort of like dictionary when it comes to this stuff. Hydromorphone, like go up to most journalists and ask them what that even is.
Well,
Good
it's
luck.
interesting that you cite that example. So this is how ideology and bias is infused into reporting. When you use the term unregulated drug supply as opposed to illegal drug supply, you're implying that the alternative is that we should regulate drugs, right? You're trying to first of all downplay the fact that these drugs are illegal, and you're saying the alternative isn't drug legalization because people don't like hearing the term legalization, but drug regulation, right? And so you're trying to present drugs like meth and cocaine and fentanyl as if they were other like regular consumer products that just need to be regulated. It's a real pet peeve of mine that this kind of language, which is very heavily biased towards radical harm reduction, is used all the time in some by some media outlets. A few others I'm not going to name. But anyways, in our last 40 seconds, what is the main takeaways that you want us to walk away from this conversation when it comes to reducing bias and improving the quality of drug reporting in Canada in general?
Always be skeptical and curious. Do not take things for what you see, what's presented to you. Challenge yourself. Seek out people who disagree with you. Find the other side. Do your homework, like you said. Learn those definitions. Get a sense of what's going on here. Look at the history. Don't just write the story as if it's existing in the present moment. Look
Mhm.
at how we got up to this point. And
Well,
yeah, that'll get you starting to get you where you need to be.
well, thank you, Harrison, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for joining us on the News Forum.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Media bias is really annoying, but at the same time, there are practical steps that we can make to improve the quality of our reporting, and it's a responsibility that every editor and journalist should take as seriously as possible.